I'll eat.
Time to pick your nose.
Get all the scratching in.
All right, so we're live. Welcome. Another second or two, just to. Oh, you know what? And Carrie will have you have my phone in case you need to communicate with the children. In my very professional studio, where we have Kevin here, it's in my house, so I have kids. Maybe it's just. I wonder if this is enough time to let people join. We won't go too deep just yet. We'll do some introductions while we wait.
Yeah.
So, first off, everyone, welcome to Chocolate Fascination, the channel all about fine chocolate. Started as a podcast and moved into YouTube live streams now. This is my, I think, fourth official one, and my first guest that is not a chocolate maker. Kevin, help me out how you say your last name.
Huang?
I've been saying it right this whole time. Psh, I should get paid for this. So Kevin Huang of New Jersey is here in Utah because he is a PhD. You call yourself a candidate?
Yeah, at this point it's a PhD candidate.
Candidate for neuroscience, and we've been toying with the idea. I think ever since I launched the podcast of having a podcast about the neuroscience of tasting, and we never did it. But now we're doing a live stream so people can marvel at our beautiful coronavirus quarantine lockdown faces. We missed out on your blue hair, unfortunately, which may not have popped well with my wall. But why don't you go ahead and give us a little background into, starting at little Kevin. It's turned into, blossomed into the flower that is before me today.
Yeah, sure. So, born and raised in New Jersey. Went to college at Rutgers University, got my bachelor's in cell biology and neuroscience, and just really had an interest in science and neuroscience in particular for the longest time. So applied for graduate schools across the country and got into the program at the University of Utah. And not only was it one of the better programs I got into, but they took us skiing at the recruitment event. So that was a pretty big draw for coming to Utah.
If you like cold.
I mean, it's got cold and hot and outside stuff, so it's.
I just stay near the fire all winter long. I hate cold so much. But that's fair though.
You just get nice ski ski pants
clothes.
and clothes, and you're just nice and toasty.
I've been told that would help. I haven't done it.
So yeah, I've been in Utah for about 6, 7 years now.
Wow.
Getting my PhD in neuroscience, which is a bit of a grind, but almost done. And I've been coming to Chocolate Society here in Utah for 3-4 years now.
Nice.
And it's just great to, eat a lot of really nice chocolate and also get to geek out about what goes through our heads when we are actually eating something or tasting chocolate.
Right. It is fun when I talk about senses and how we taste, and Kevin gives me a little, actually. But I'm like, look, man, I don't know. I'm a manufacturing engineer. I know how to cut things and screw stuff together. I know how to tell other people to do that. Yeah, duct tape, chewing gum, and epoxy. No, so having you be in there, you've definitely helped elevate the intellectual nature of some of the conversations when we get into the science behind things. What kinds of science are related to neuroscience? What do you have to know about to be able to do neuroscience? Certainly chemistry.
So these days, neuroscience is a pretty multidisciplinary field. It probably draws heaviest from biology. But neuroscience has gotten pretty broad. So you've got physics people in there, electrical engineers doing electrophysiology, which is measuring the actual electrical impulses in neurons as they fire. And then you have sort of the behavioral psychology side where people are looking at more, how do behaviors change? What components make up a particular learning and memory task.
This is where the neural pathway conversations come in.
The neural pathway, the brain region conversations,
Okay.
that kind of thing. Um, and then there are, bioengineers that look at prosthesis and electrodes. There are, as you said, the chemists looking at, you know, protein conformation and shape, um, as well as molecular biologists looking at DNA and geneticists, as well as protein function and kind of like the really nuts and bolts of how an individual neuron functions or
Okay.
talks to their partners.
So neuroscience is a big umbrella
Yes.
that covers everything that has to do. I mean, are you focusing on humans specifically and other animals as pertains to humans, or are you looking across animals?
I mean, it depends on the person, depends on their research,
Okay.
depends on the field of study. My particular research, I work in mice, and they're used as a proxy for humans.
Okay.
But I work on a pretty basic question about how some types of cells, the astrocytes in the brain, help to form connections between neurons, which are
Okay.
the uh, nervous cell systems that are actually talking to each other.
Interesting.
But that's a super basic question. But then you also have people who are working on things that are a little more immediately relevant, how Alzheimer's develops and how to treat that,
Wow.
or Parkinson's and some of the neurodegenerative diseases, as well as all the way down to how do we actually form memories and learn things. You know,
The plasticity of that.
right, right.
Nice. I want to throw in a few good words here and there, like neuroplasticity.
That's a good word.
Well, before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about you and chocolate.
Yep.
You were in Utah. You've said 6, 7 years. You've been in Utah now,
Yep.
which is chocolate. This is ground zero for like the best chocolate out there. And I happen to know the Chocolate Society started 10 years ago. So what took the 3-ish years before you came and joined us?
So I actually found out about Chocolate Society from word of mouth from a good friend who worked at the imaging core up at the University of Utah.
Okay.
And so, it was late night working there and got to talking um, with Mike. Was it Mike? Mike, and just, mentioned that there was a chocolate thing happening like the next night and I should go and check it out. And since then, I've just been trying to go regularly just because it's.
Was that your introduction to chocolate?
Yes.
So,
Well,
like fine chocolate?
yeah, I think so.
It's a heck of a dive. Right.
But it hadn't really had any kind of introduction into like what makes a nice bar or a good bar and how
Right.
is it made and so on and so forth. So
Nice.
yeah.
How early on did you start thinking about the neurology of fine chocolate and in terms of how you experience it and appreciate it, as especially as contrasted with the kind of chocolate we all grow up with, except my kids.
I mean, I think um, it might not be something that like I wouldn't say it's something that I think of particularly often, but just because it's my part of my background and
Right.
I don't really notice the way I approach it, and just because it's the background I bring with the chocolate and just the way I think about it, the way I sort of taste it.
Right.
So, I mean, it's kind of just.
We may have an issue
Oh.
with,
The camera.
I think it froze. Let me just do that real quick.
For those that, well, everyone besides Kevin, we're trying out something new with our camera, and we may have connectivity issues.
Yeah, it's not.
We had a couple little hiccups while we practiced.
Not like that.
Right. And then when we go live, more hiccups. How's it looking?
It's a circle saying connecting.
Well, no worries. Minor technical issues.
Minor.
Possibly,
The
possibly no video.
we were streaming it private, and then when we go to watch it, it would just jump like after the fact. So I imagine for anyone that could have been watching,
Should I finish and restart the broadcast, or does that start it as something else?
I think I'll start with something else.
Okay.
Is it theoretically going right now?
There's still a timer going.
Oh.
But there's just
Hopefully we're still live.
Paused, and this is swirling. I don't know what to do. I didn't do this at all. It filmed for an hour.
Right.
And nothing now.
Is there anybody that's...
They're here. I don't know if they're still... Oh, good.
Oh, that's good.
I guess you guys could keep talking if you want. Or I could turn this around and have that awful waste of a day. I don't know, what do you think?
Jimmy's saying that we can't badmouth our viewers since they can hear us while we're troubleshooting.
What do you think I should do? Turn this around?
Yeah. I bet it'll start working shortly after getting it up.
Do you want me to pull this?
Ooh, we can't. This is how it's gonna go.
Okay, how does that look? I can't see.
I want to see the mouse. Let's see. Nope. There we go. All right. Well, I guess we'll be using this camera. Kara, if you get that camera working again, let me know, I guess. But we
with this.
hopefully this will still allow us to, let's see, this direction. Here we go. Hopefully this will still allow us to continue on. But Mr. Kevin,
Yeah.
let's see. You were talking a little bit about
it's
tasting.
good to bring that background with the Chocolate Society, and just it's been interesting having those conversations and sort of figuring out that's maybe a different way of thinking about or tasting,
Right.
just because it's hard to notice your own background and
Right.
how you're approaching it because of
It's the only background you know.
yeah,
right?
exactly.
So let's talk then about kind of the basics of what we mean with neuroscience and experiencing food. Because when I teach people like an introduction to chocolate, I always ask them, how many senses do you think we have? And people, they give me a fun range. Usually, people start with 5. And you
Right.
get someone that's being clever, and they'll say 6, and you get the little clown that says 7, and I'm like, 19 or 21, somewhere in that range.
17 to 21, depending on how you slice it.
Yeah, how you want to measure,
Yeah.
how you want to count. So, and then as soon as I tell them a little bit about proprioception and how our ability to touch our ear without looking at it
Yeah.
is because we know where our limbs are when we don't look at them to
right.
an extent. Then I say, but that's not what we're talking about today. And then I go back to the classic 5. But
Right.
what is it that what does it mean to experience a food on a zoomed out level?
So I guess on a super zoomed out level, right? If you think about the brain as the seat of human consciousness, your perception of the world is something that the brain sort of puts together and builds for itself, right?
Based on physics and chemistry.
based on everything that it sees from the outside. So if I guess if we were all of this sensory data the brain takes in, and it builds a kind of map of everything that's going on, everything outside, it builds that perception of the outside world.
Okay.
And that is what we interact with, that what we have, what we see and feel and touch, that's all sort of a simulation that our brain has built.
Right. And you mentioned when we talked before planning this, the latency between, if we touch something or see something, right? When the light enters our eye and interacts with our retina before our brain perceives it and makes some sense of it.
So that's kind of the interesting thing, right? Different sensory modalities have different speeds of transmission. So
and modality being like the type of sense.
Okay. So vision is super quick. It hits light hits your eye. There's a reaction there, and then it creates a signal that propagates backwards, and it's a super short connection between back of your eye and then your brain. Whereas touch would be a little bit slower, and especially touch from, say, the bottom of your foot versus something like on your ear or on your head. Just the physics of it in terms of how fast that signal transmits across your nerve from a couple inches versus a couple meters.
Right.
So with that, there's some really interesting research about how your brain has all of these different speeds, and it has to figure out, okay, what is happening at the same time, and what is happening in the sequential order, because that's kind of important for stuff to for your brain to build that simulation, right? Did a sound happen with the thing that you're seeing, or are they two different events, right?
Okay.
And so turns out one of the things your brain does to make sure that all of this stuff, where it's sort of matching everything that belongs together, is that it delays things by a couple milliseconds to let everything come in and give it like just a small buffer time to just say like, okay, this is a beat, and everything that comes in within this little buffer is part of this same event.
Okay.
And it binds it together. So, the kind of trippy philosophical, well, not philosophical, but the trippy kind of part about this is that your perception of the world is just a couple milliseconds in the past.
Right. What we think we're seeing now, like the light hit our retina a couple milliseconds ago.
Your brain kind of like, I'm going to buffer for a second and wait for all the touch information, all the sound information, all the smell information, all of that to come together really quickly. And then I'm just, because you can imagine that the wider this buffer period is, the more accurately the brain can place things temporally.
Right.
But there's a really big cost to doing that, because the further you're living in the past, the longer it takes you to react to anything, and that's a pretty obvious negative.
That roof that you see up there is actually tripping you right now.
Right, or that snake you see right there is something you need to react to now, rather than 5 seconds from now when you've realized that the rattling sound belongs to the snake.
Huh. Okay, so that kind of implies that there's sort of like a max speed that humans can be to process things because of that latency that's built in. And I'm sure it varies from person to person.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it varies. I'm not sure how much this buffer compares to like reaction speeds, like with athletes.
Right.
And I'm sure there's you can ingrain reflexes that will sort of butt up against this in terms of like, if your brain's like, I don't need to wait for everything else.
Right.
There's a thing I have to respond to right now. It'll just go. You can go and do that.
Right.
But the interesting example of this is sort of first time as far as that buffer period and how flexible your brain is in attaching events to or visual stimuli to sound stimuli is when people were first matching up sound with movies.
Okay.
Um, they realized that they had a lot of like 30 to 50 milliseconds of slop that they could be off by in either direction,
Right.
with when the sound occurs and when the video shows it. And that slop is the brain basically saying like, okay, well, if anything comes in this period, I'm just going to push it in with
Right.
like what I think is the right timing.
Right. Yeah, you see that with setting up home theaters. It's like you move it, and when I kind of became aware of this setting, the units were bigger than I thought they would be. I was like, no, wait a minute. I thought, because we can hear differences in sound that are like, however, when you're matching it up with the picture, it can be off by this huge margin. Huge.
Like 50, which is
50.
pretty big.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely hear 50
Right.
millisecond differences.
Yeah.
And it's just weird that our brain is like, man, I got this. Our brains are weird. And I like that early on you talked about the seed of consciousness, because that's where it starts getting philosophical, right?
Yeah.
Because like neuroscience cannot definitively say what is consciousness at this point, from my understanding. Is that right?
Not not an area that I've spent too much time reading the literature, so I'm not sure what the current state of things is. I do think it's more of a it's a really complex question,
Oh, yeah.
and neuroscience is still. I mean, I'm sure there's people out there trying to grapple with this,
Sure.
but in terms of we're still trying to figure out how memories work, and that's
Yeah.
a super complicated question.
And why it is that they're not like a photograph, right? You can go in and change your purpose, let alone on accident. So yeah, memories are weird.
Even just trying to figure out how they're stored and how you retrieve them has been very tricky, and there's 5 or 6 equally plausible theories out there that still pretty fuzzy about
Right.
how memory actually works.
Which is a kind of a sobering thought. It's like we've figured out so much on our planet and the universe, and then we look inwards and we're like, yikes, we have a long way to go. Which is cool. I mean, we're such.
And that's one of the exciting things about neuroscience, just because there's so much unexplored territory
Sure.
with it compared to some of the other science disciplines where, some of the disciplines just feel like the borders have been set and you're just kind of like filling in like the puzzle.
Right.
Or if there are still missing borders, you at least found the corner pieces.
Right.
And neuroscience is like, we're not sure if this is a corner piece or an edge or just something in the middle somewhere.
Right.
And there's just a lot of missing pieces that have yet to be found.
Interesting. So with all that, let's start talking about when we experience food. And especially in the context of chocolate, because that's what we're here to do. What is the first sense that's usually engaged?
I mean, as a species, usually the first thing that we engage when we do anything is vision, right? Just because we're such a visual species. And so typically before you make a decision to put something in your mouth, you're looking at it, right? And you look at it, you pick it up, you're touching it, maybe you're smelling it as well. All that happens before you make the decision to put something into your mouth, right?
I had a hilarious situation when I was teaching a class. I asked people, what do you think is the most, what sense do we use the most to gather information about the world around us? And somebody in this class said smell. And I was like, interesting. Next time you're driving down the freeway, plug your nose and see how well you do. I bet you'll be okay. However, don't close your eyes. Because turns out that is definitely the one that you really need when you're driving. So, that was an interesting one. I've heard 90% of the information our bodies take in is through our eyeballs.
I'm not actually familiar with that statistic, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I could not cite a source if if my life depended on it.
I mean, if we want to nerd out a little bit, so if you look at the brain regions, right? Um, Basically, there's an entire lobe of the cortex, and it's huge. It's called the visual cortex, and it's basically your entire like back portion of your brain is
Really?
devoted to visual processing.
Why the back?
Um, that's a good question, and I think that gets into a lot of like developmental neuroscience and evolutionary neuroscience about like where that came from.
Future podcast
But-
or future episode.
But as far as light hits your eyes,
Right.
the rods and the cones turn that light stimuli into a chemical, electrochemical stimulus,
Okay.
and transmits that signal. It travels through your optic nerve to a portion, and it crosses over in the portion of your it's been a while since I took neuroanatomy, but
I've never taken it.
there's a little area it crosses over from, and then it just streams to the back of your brain.
Crosses over as in right goes to left and left goes to right.
It's half right. So
Good.
basically everything for your right side visual field goes to the left side of the brain, and everything on the left side visual field goes to the right side of the brain, and it's like half of the retina from the left eye. So things mirror back and forth in the visual
Right.
system, but if you think about it with your left eye, right, half of the retina, the left side of the left retina sees things on the right side,
Right.
and the right side of the retina on the left eye sees stuff on the left side.
Upside
And
down.
so that flips backwards, and so those stream to the visual cortex, and then the visual cortex does a bunch of visual processing,
Okay.
and then also sends that information to a bunch of all the other regions of the brain,
Right.
and that gets processed. And so there's an enormous portion of our brain that's basically devoted to visual processing.
Okay. And then when we're looking at things, like my understanding is things moving and things stationary get treated differently by our bodies. Right. I guess we're predators. We've got eyes in the front of our faces, and like we're really finely tuned to see movement.
Yeah, so I think by the time once it gets to the visual cortex, right, there's a lot of pre-processing that happens in the retina, shapes and edges and contrast.
Oh, okay.
Sure if that image processing happens in the retina, because they keep finding more and more systems that are kind of like, oh, this does some like contrast stuff, or this finds edges or corners, and
So we have pre-processor in our
you have
actual
pre-processing.
eyes.
And then once it gets the visual cortex, a lot of that information sort of shared, but then split up and
Right.
sent in different directions. And so something that is a little more complex, where you're trying to recognize an object, right? That might go in one pathway that's a little slower, but a lot more detailed, and like, this is a house,
Right.
rather than a rectangle.
Okay. Yeah.
But then I think in that sort of splitting, right, it can go in different directions. If like, oh, something is moving towards me, I need to figure out like how I need to respond to that. So
maybe
that could be
some images get piped over to your amygdala, and it does its crazy like
yeah.
the fight, flight, freeze
Yeah,
response, right?
Yeah.
So okay, when we're looking at chocolate, what are the things that we can see when we're looking at it? Like, what does that mean to us?
So I think with chocolate, right, it's a sort of manufactured food.
Right.
And so as with a lot of food items, it's I would have to say a lot of it's really just a learned kind of behavior. And so like what you see and what you get out of seeing something, right, depends heavily on what you've experienced before.
Okay.
Right. It's comparing it to things that you've eaten in the past that were tasty or useful or delicious.
I'm guessing
Versus
this comes in with all the senses, not just sight, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's not a lot of things that are sort of like, I guess, genetically hardwired
Okay.
in terms of see something, it just means something, like a one-to-one kind of like mapping.
Okay.
Although of all the senses, taste actually has a lot more of that,
Oh, okay.
which I think we can get into in a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit.
That makes sense. But with vision, like something's moving towards you, you blink and flinch.
Right.
But that's kind of the extent of it. I guess bright, you close your eyes.
I mean, there's a lot of autonomic stuff in terms of like how your eyes deal with light,
Okay.
possibly with how you deal with objects coming towards you. But
In terms of chocolate, we're kind of everything that we see with chocolate.
It's a learned behavior.
We're looking at it with our memory bank of other images. So we look at colors, we look at sheen, we look at the mold.
Right. And
Okay.
I mean, depending on how much experience you have with it, right? If you've been eating chocolate and tasting chocolate for a while, right,
Right.
you'd probably be looking at like the luster, the shape,
Right.
How big it is.
How thick it is. That
Right,
tells a lot.
right.
That's interesting because, like, the average person that hasn't had fine chocolate yet,
Mm-hmm.
when they look at chocolate, like, they see chocolate. Right?
Right.
And they say, chocolate's chocolate, right? I mean, it's brown, it's sweet, I like it. Makes me happy at Christmas and Halloween, right? And when you start getting into chocolate or cheese or whatever, you start noticing some of the details because you've built up this memory bank that carries significance. So we look at it, and I debated using a Madagascar chocolate tonight because it's flavor-wise, it's such a unique experience, and color-wise, it's so light in terms of the shade, and then it's very reddish in terms of hue. Which my understanding is like rods and cones kind of playing in there both, right?
So not really.
Oh,
it's
good.
it's just the cones.
Just the cones.
Yeah. So rods are sort of like contrast and movement
Okay.
receptors. Like they're best for just light, dark, and movement. And so, interesting thing is that you have a lot of those on the periphery of your vision. So, if you're trying to get your night sight going, they adapt a lot faster, and you have a little better night vision on your periphery.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard don't look directly at something at night. You can see it better with your peripheral vision.
Yeah, especially when stargazing, you can see you see different wavelengths.
Right.
Short, medium, and long. And
it does ranges though, right? It's not just
so that's how you do color though, right? Like they have a preferred wavelength they respond to, and they have a response curve to other wavelengths, right?
I see.
And so you pair up three of them, and now you suddenly have three data points to okay, so I see a color. The short one responds a lot, medium one responds a little, and the long one doesn't respond at all. Now I can plot that color against all three responses and come up with, a subcolor.
Blue.
Right. And so that's how you're getting color perception. Or colorblind are missing one of these cones.
So it's a hole in the response curve, kind of.
It's a hole in the response curve, so they have a lot of trouble distinguishing between colors because as suddenly, instead of having three data points to fix to a wavelength, you only have two, and you don't know if you're on the outside or the inside of that curve.
Okay. This would be a great opportunity for a whiteboard if I'd have gotten it ready. Because I understand response curves from an audio background, from looking at speaker response curves.
If it makes
it's the same kind of idea.
If it makes sense, think about 3 points like a tripod, mark out a plane.
Okay.
And so if you're missing one of the legs, right now you're wobbling and you can't really, you don't, it's a lot harder to figure out what color is what because you're missing that third reference point.
Right. Huh. Okay. Fascinating. So the cones are what's giving us really the shade and the hue.
Right.
So like how bright, and so it's
fovea. And so that's basically, if you notice, when you look at something straight on, right, that is the light goes straight and beams onto your fovea because that's where you have the best visual acuity.
Okay. Is that the maculus? Is that the same idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's that's why, if you try to look at something from the corner of your eye, right, it's really hard to figure out what it is without actually looking at it. And there's a couple of cool experiments you can do with colored pencils or something colored, and basically you can see what the color is at the center of your vision, but if you're trying to like bring it out from your periphery, see at what point you can actually determine what color it is.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that we don't actually see the color in the side, and I've tried to test it. Like, no, I can tell, but I've not. That colored pencil's a good idea. I think Dayton had. Did you add that one, Carrie? That's a good combo or a good comment. Did you see what Dayton said? Instead of between two ferns, it's
a fern between nerds.
Fern between two nerds. Good one, Dayton.
Yeah.
It fits. All right. So in terms of chocolate or vision, right? We've seen the chocolate. We've seen the shape, the size, the thickness, the color, the sheen.
Yeah.
Which I imagine we could go for a long time as to like what is a sheen in terms of our vision? How do we see this? But it's kind of has to do with reflection and stuff. Which my next guest I want to have on is a PhD in food, specializing in fats and oils, and we will talk about the crystalline structure that gives us sheen.
Awesome.
Future episode. Watch out for that one. So what we need to talk about next is we've seen it. We've come up with some assumptions if we've tasted it before. If we haven't tasted that before, if we don't recognize it, we might be assuming based on what we've tasted in the past and saying like, I think this could be like such and such. So I usually recommend to people that they smell next.
Mm-hmm. But in between smelling, you're touching and picking it up as well.
Or using telekinesis. Which I'm sure that you've got the people working on that part too, right?
I mean...
You can neither confirm nor deny.
If anyone figures that out, I'd love to not have to get up to grab a cup of water.
Right. Bring over the water. Right? That'd be good. Okay, so what do we tell... What are we sensing and noticing and experiencing when we pick up the chocolate?
So I mean, like, it's that immediate physical touch of the chocolate, right? Smoothness, texture,
right?
And then weight, and then is it like dense? Is it light? Kind of airy, like a wafer?
Sure.
And then scope.
Being the actual neuron receptors. Right. Okay.
But touch itself.
Are these what we'd call nerve endings?
I guess, yeah. I think you could call them nerve endings.
Okay. It's like at the end of the wires, there's a little receptor that's actually interacting with the world.
Yeah.
And then you got to drink your Gatorade with electrolytes to pipe that signal back to the brain, right?
Yeah, and so basically, what things that take a nervous system signal from point A to point B is basically the axon. It's long, thin tube of a cell, and it does this really cool electrochemical signal. It uses ions instead of electrons, but sodium and chlorine and potassium ions to create an electrical gradient and a concentration gradient, and uses that to submit the signal. But
so it moves ions around.
So
it changes the concentration
at
the border from cell to cell.
So it neurons will they set up an electrochemical gradient, which means that they pump sodium across a membrane. The membrane's made of fat, so it's an insulator. And so as they pump ions across that gradient, they develop an electric charge.
Okay.
Right? And so what this does is it lets it set up this kind of hairpin trigger where the moment it gets the signal to open up these channels and start letting ions through, right? It rapidly changes that electrical charge on the surface, and that's how the signal propagates down the axon.
Okay.
But then once it hits the end of the neuron and the end of the axon, it has to talk to the next neuron. So you've heard of serotonin, dopamine.
Yeah.
Depending on the cell, it'll have different neurotransmitters. Those are basically stuck right up against the next cell. And so the moment they release, they hit the next cell. The next cell, they have little pores that take these neurotransmitters, and once it recognizes them, opens the pore, changes that electrochemical gradient, and the signal's off and down the next axon.
So all of that is happening for every cell in the chain to get to the brain.
Yes.
To perceive some sense.
Yes.
Ha. That doesn't sound as fast as, like, the way you described that doesn't sound as fast as I feel like I feel.
Yeah, and so that electrical part helps make it really quick.
Right.
The other part is that for things that have to happen quickly, right, the brain tries to make that as few jumps as possible.
Sure.
For most touch responses, right, it's touch, one neuron from the receptor to your spine, one neuron from your spine to your brain, and then from your brain, just like vision, it just goes in a whole bunch of different places.
Wait, so from my finger to my spine, there's one nerve cell?
One nerve that goes all the way there. So same for in your foot. One nerve.
One cell?
So they're in bundles, right?
Okay.
Because they talk to a bunch of different receptors.
But it's not going cell.
No.
Cell.
That's more of in the brain when it's doing processing. And
so, like, for that one nerve ending, it's got a single jump to the spine.
And then one single jump from the spine to the brain.
So these axons are long.
Yes. They can be meters long.
What? This is new information for me.
Yeah.
Did you know that you had individual cells that were from your foot? So you're saying, like, from my toe to
your spine,
my sacrum, basically.
Yeah.
Like the lower part of my spine.
Probably more like the lumbar.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm not sure there's nerves in the spinal cord goes down like to the coccyx.
Okay. So like at the bottom of the lumbar spines where the spinal cord branches off everywhere.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. And then that's one more cell to the brain.
Yep.
And the brain's like, and now I will take my time.
Yeah.
Such as it is.
Yeah.
Wow.
And there's a bunch of things that the brain can do to make that faster or slower. The brain will like wrap these axons with fat called myelination. And so instead of having to go propagate linearly, it jumps from one node, one gap in the wrapping, right? It just wraps in bundles. It jumps from this node to this node to this node to this node, and that speeds it up even faster.
Huh. So, like a railgun.
Yeah, basically.
Awesome. That's wow, that's crazy. So when we pick something up,
right?
On the phone yesterday, we talked about the senses of touch, because this is one where when we talk about the different senses of the human body, the sense of touch is probably the most subdivided one. Because we were mentioning, without even getting into pain or proprioception, I think you mentioned 5.
Yeah.
Touch. What do you call
these?
Modalities, right?
Yeah. And so touch, I mean, it all comes together as one thing from the brain, putting all those signals together. But for the most part, all the touch sort of receptors are, they basically look at stretch, pressure, and vibration.
Okay. And a couple of those are 2 different versions.
Right. Not super familiar with exactly how they work, but some of them look like giant lollipops, and they're really interesting to look at. But for most of your sensory nerves, it follows something similar in that there's a specialized ending or a specialized cell that responds to something.
Okay.
And then it passes that to the neuron that takes it to your spine, which then passes it to a neuron that takes it to your brain, and then your brain does all like the processing. So with vision, it's the rods and the cones. They turn light into that neurotransmitter signal and then send it off to another cell, and that cell takes it to the brain. For touch, you have all these special nerve ending heads that respond to kind of shear forces.
Okay.
Right? And the way that they're layered and set up, they amplify or respond to different physical like movements differently.
So if you think about the structure of the skin, when you touch something, it stretches, it gets squished.
Right, you get pressure from your skin, your tissue kind of deforming under what you're touching, and then like the skin around it stretches, and then if you move your finger on something, right, there's some vibration with that as well.
Oh, okay.
So all of that comes together.
And the pressure as well,
right?
Which the pressure is probably how like you can hold a screwdriver and tap something. And you can kind of, it's almost as if it extends your own arm in terms of sensing, because you can feel that pressure, and your brain does some magic to to feel with it, or the same thing with your fingernail. Like you don't have nerve endings in your fingernail, but you can still feel pressure when it touches something because it's pushing on some other nerves.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And then depending on how much pressure there is, and we know how much we're squeezing it, we can tell kind of how much it weighs, and that probably goes into the arm
proprioception.
Okay.
Right, because some of these receptors are then buried in muscles and tendons, and that gives you your sense of, as you mentioned before, your sense of where your body is in space. Right. So you can close your eyes and move your hand, and you know where your hand is.
Right.
And
a blind person can do sign language, even though they won't be able to see it.
Yeah. And so, if you think about, how much resistance and in your muscles and tendons there are. So when you pick something up, that changes. And so that's part of where you're getting that sense of like, how heavy or dense is this, right? Because once you've moved it, right, if you're moving your empty hand, like you're really familiar with that, but then you're moving with something in your hand and you're like, oh, this is actually like more effort that I needed to exert to pick it up and move it towards my mouth.
So you can respond before you smack yourself with it.
Right.
Good. That's important for me. There's so much SMHing happening down with my wife as she's being the producer of this episode.
Yeah.
She gets to hear my terrible jokes all the time. So, what else do we need to know about touch, or should we move on?
I think that's
smell?
That's mostly there.
Without trying to turn all of us into neuroscientists. That's a good start.
Yeah.
I guess the key takeaway is there's all these different versions of how we, like when we move or don't move, and when skin and our bodies respond to physical things, it moves different nerves different ways, and they do their neurotransmitting.
Yep.
I should be a neuroscientist. All right. So then I recommend that people would smell chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
What I've heard is we can smell, like, and I don't know what this would actually mean. I haven't really questioned this, but this conversation is making me, it's pointing out more of the holes in what I thought I understood. But we can smell 10,000 different things, as opposed to our sense of taste is far more limited in scope. But like some individual molecules, people don't think about it in this way very often, but when you smell ammonia, you can identify NH3, right?
Right.
And then it turns out, like chocolate being a really complicated food, it's got somewhere in the 800, 900 chemical compound constituency, and these things can evaporate and you can smell them. What does smell mean?
So olfaction, pretty complicated.
Olfaction. This is a word that I know and I could have said.
But I guess just to sort of walk through the basics of olfaction, and apologies in advance if I get this slightly off, but in your nose, you have a lot of these olfactory bulbs, right?
Sure.
And just like all the other things we've been talking about, the olfactory bulbs will respond to a chemical. They turn that into a signal. They pass that on to a neuron that takes it to the brain,
right?
And you come up with a smell. Olfaction's a little different from vision or touch, right? Whereas vision and touch have like really stereotyped receptors, rods and cones, Meissner's corpuscles, and a whole bunch of other I just like the word.
That's-
It's the only one I remember.
I'm going to need you to say that one again.
Meissner's corpuscles?
So this is named after somebody.
I assume so.
Meissner's corpuscles?
Yeah.
Corpsicle? Like a frozen dead body? Corpsicle? we got here. Thanks, Emily. Keeping it classy. I would expect nothing less.
Let's get to that in a couple minutes.
Good.
But just the physical act of smelling something, right? So in contrast to some of the other senses that have a pretty like limited repertoire of receptors, right, that are all like very stereotyped.
Right.
Olfactory bulbs are a little different in that you get a whole different set of them, right? And they'll respond to different molecules, different shapes of stuff coming in, right?
So it's like fitting the shaped block into the child's toy kind of situation.
Right. And so these olfactory bulbs will express one of these. If you get a chemical that floats in through your nose and bounces around and binds to these olfactory bulbs, things that fit, open that channel, produce a signal, and then that sends that signal on to your brain.
Okay.
And so it gets kind of complicated at this point because, there's a variety of different channels or matching shapes.
Right.
And you do have particular olfactory bulbs that respond to just one chemical.
Oh, really?
Right?
Okay.
And so those are the ones that people love to use for research because they like, oh, yeah, this one chemical activates that one neuron. We see it in like every different mouse we test.
Are there any?
And it's super easy to use.
Are there any examples of that people would know? That you know?
Not off the top of my head because it's not my area of research.
Fair enough.
But some of my friends are in that field, and there's some chemicals that just pop up over and over again because it's a super stereotype, very well understood chemical, right? But it's a very simple molecule. So like you were saying for ammonia, right? That might be one of the ones that just responds to one particular olfactory bulb. Right. But then when we look at more complex scents, right, that are from complex molecules and mixtures of molecules,
right.
At that point you get a whole bunch of different activation of different olfactory bulbs. Okay. And there's kind of like the eye, there's a bunch of pre-processing that's happening.
Oh, okay.
And that's still not super well characterized.
Sure.
And then so by the time it gets to your brain, it's trying to figure things out and match them, and it's how you get some of these more complex scents, right? Like if you think about the smell of grilling meat, barbecue, right?
Yes.
There's a ton of stuff going on there. Or with
so much good.
The smoked chocolate that Lance does.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of different odors and smells going on with smoke.
Let's say aromas.
Sure. And so there's a lot of processing and crosstalk and signals like kind of coming together, and if you think about how the eye does those 3-point things, the olfactory is more like thousands of those points coming together to make that odor signal. Okay. And then Emily asking about like emotional responses to smells, right?
Emotional, right?
Emily. It's that's after that signal's gotten to the brain, right? And probably talked about this before, but the brain associates smells with emotions pretty strongly. Okay. And so it's pretty easy to start attaching emotional valence to smells.
Interesting. Okay. And it could be any sort of thing. It could be sad, happy,
right,
whatever.
Right.
Interesting. Now, I've heard too that there's erectile tissue in the nose. So I wonder if that's related.
I'm actually not too sure about that. I'm not familiar with again, the olfactory system's not really a field of focus for me. So
that's fair. I've heard it too said that smell is the sense, or olfaction, if we want to get all neuroscience-y, is a sense that's most strongly tied to memory. Have you ever heard that? Does that come up in
Yeah, and I mean,
your nerd fests and
there's a
school?
little bit of pop science to that, I
Okay,
think, but I think it goes to that sort of emotional valence,
sure.
right?
Because it's an important survival mechanism.
Right.
We can tell some pretty important things about food and other things, right?
Right.
We can smell blood. We can smell rot.
It's a pretty
And,
early like sense that was developed,
right.
and it's been kept through all these iterations of evolution
Can't drive
because
down the freeway with it.
it's because it's useful though, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And the I guess if you think about like how strongly that sense of smell is tied into what we eat, right? Because like one of the first things that you might encounter from like if you can't see food, right, but you can smell it from miles away,
right?
That's a super valuable trait to be able to say like, oh yes, that smells like something that will get me calories, and the more calories I can get more efficiently, the more likely I am to pass on my genes.
Right. Be alive.
Right.
Or that smells like bread that I can eat, and I like bread.
Yeah.
As one example.
Right.
Or steak, as you mentioned.
Mostly cooking meat, right?
Barbecue. Yeah, we can definitely smell that. But a lot of people, including our family, my wife, have been taking up cooking bread in the time of the Rona. And it makes for beautiful smells, at the end of that. I'm like, I know what time it is. It's time to go downstairs. So that's kind of interesting. With chocolate, there's so much complexity with the chemicals. In terms of the complexity of chemicals for smells and flavors, it's one of the most complex foods out there. And it can tell such a broad array of stories from the tree itself to where it's grown to how it's fermented. And a lot of these can eclipse others and things, and all the way to the roast and the grind and how old it is and if it's been sitting in the fridge. And like there's all these things that it can pick up and lose and everything else through the process.
And what smells you're sort of getting rid of in the process.
Right. Because anything we smell is no longer part of that bar. It left.
Not only that, but the things that you've denatured during the roasting process, things that have come out that are more volatile,
and evaporated
during the conching or the grinding,
right,
and how that impacts everything that's left behind.
Sure. Yeah, I mean the smell is like that right there. Anybody that thinks, oh, maybe I can't taste, I can't tell the difference between good chocolate and bad. I guarantee you can. If you can smell, you can tell the difference between over vanillaed with fake vanilla, or vanillin, right, which is the key component of vanilla, but it's usually taken from wood. If that's what they're using to flavor the chocolate as opposed to bits of actual vanilla bean, you can smell that. It doesn't take an expert taster, smeller. It's just that awareness. Just once you catalog that away in your repertoire of smell memory, then you smell it again. You're like, oh yeah, that's a Hershey's Kiss. I know this, and you decide from there what you want to do. I'm too snobby. So, is there anything else we need to say about smell?
I think that's about it. I mean, mostly just that, what you're smelling can impact pretty heavily on what you taste further on, right?
So most of what we taste is actually smell, right?
Yeah. So 2 ways for scents to get into your nose: stuff in the front of the nose, just from inhaling, but then as you chew, you force air up through the back of what's it called, like retronasal, to the back of your throat into your nose, and so that's where you get a lot of that flavor too.
I feel like it's a good chance for me to say another fancy word: postglottal. So as we're tasting, and in the case of chocolate, because it's melting, it's releasing more of these volatile compounds that can face, and you can smell it from both directions. Do we interact with it differently from within as compared without?
I think so, in that just in terms of like where the olfactory receptors are
Sure.
placed, and like how much is circulating.
Okay.
And then on top of that, as you're chewing, you're throwing up more particles. Your saliva starts to break stuff down.
Right.
All of that stuff can change what kind of stuff, what kind of molecules are coming off of
Right.
what you're eating.
Yeah, some chocolate feels like, we say effervescent, not in a bubbly way, but in a, like, it feels like it's evaporating a lot. Like there's a lot of vapor pressure going on with some chocolates compared to others. Yeah, that's where we can tell the bulk of the story in terms of the flavor comes from our nose.
And so that's where
Our
you get a lot of like
olfactory bulbs.
that's where you get a lot of like the sort of aromatic kind of like flavors from. As far as right, you've got the 5 commonly accepted taste: salty, sour, umami, bitter. Right.
I got you.
And
earlier you mentioned that our sense of taste directly is a good thing to help us identify danger, and I think bitterness is one of those big ones, right?
Right. So as far as like things that are more genetically inclined, right? Bitterness was a super useful trait to figure out things that were rotten, things that were poisonous or no good to eat. And so bitterness is typically an aversive taste.
Right.
But it kind of like...
A lot of poisons are bitter, right?
Right.
And then bleach, from my experience, is very bitter.
Ingesting bleach to deal with the corona?
Well, just and they get the light. That was an early Rona joke.
But yeah, so I mean, I think that goes to show the sort of the plastic nature of what we find enjoyable about food.
Right.
This is kind of ingrained as something that's aversive, but plenty of people love bitter foods.
Right.
Right.
Well, it seems like of the acquired taste kind of foods, bitterness is a common
bitterness and
component.
Spice.
Right.
Right.
So people that are really into, say, beer,
mm-hmm.
like especially the IPAs, like they like to go for like more and more bitterness when they get the hoppy flavors.
Right.
Same thing with coffee. People start out with coffee in terms of like the way I started with chocolate, namely full of fat and sugar. And then with time, coffee nerds start taking a lot of that out.
Right.
With chocolate, you're not going to take out all the fat because it's so fatty. Thank goodness, it's so good. But there's a lot, like bitterness is one of those things that it's kind of a hurdle to get over, it seems like.
Yeah, but I mean, just look at like the strength of that kind of learning and memory portion of your experience with food, right? You can learn to like things that are kind of aversive to begin with, right? But tons of people love spicy food.
Right.
Bitterness isn't something that comes naturally to what we enjoy in food, but lots of people love bitter foods.
Right.
So, it's just kind of like what you're exposed to, what you grow to like, that sort of like that higher level cognitive sort of learning of, oh, I had this thing. It was really bitter, but it was actually pretty tasty. I want more of it. Right. And suddenly bitter's gone from this danger signal to something that is a positive reinforcement for taste.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and it's kind of interesting because, again, like I'll speak just for myself here. Getting into chocolate before, like when I was an ignorant snob, I was going for darker and darker and more bitter chocolate because I associated dark chocolate as being good, better than milk chocolate, and dark chocolate was bitter. So if it got darker and more bitter, then that made it more better. And when I met Matt Caputo for the first time, he was describing like, a lot of people think that like the more bitter and more unpleasant it is, it's like this macho thing. They think they lie to themselves and tell themselves they like it. And Carrie was looking at me because she used to decry what I now know as garbage chocolate as tasting like battery acid. And I used to say, well, if you had more taste, you would understand how good this is. And then when I have a guy that seems very authoritative tell us it's like this ridiculous macho thing, don't do it, There's a lot of vindication that happened in the general vicinity of my wife. And she
I
looked
told
at
you
me.
so's.
Yeah, well, just with the eyes. And it was a
That's
lot.
all you need, though.
If I'm going to be, toot my own humble horn here, I also said, yeah, you totally told me that. Because she did. Anyway, it was kind of a fascinating thing. Good chocolate still has bitterness, but it tends to dial it way back.
I mean,
Tends to.
it's not like there isn't good 100% bars for the people who really like that bitterness.
Yeah, that's definitely an acquired taste.
It is.
We can include that. Actually, it goes perfectly with it. People that go black coffee, 100% chocolate.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't do 100%. I have had. We had when Toak came to visit. They let me try this aged for 3 years, 100%, and I was like, "This is a good, like not like passable, but like good. Reach for it on purpose, kind of good, which I don't do with 100%. I would for theirs. It was fascinating.
I have friends who are big fans of Scotch.
Okay.
And, sitting in a conversation with them and you were trading notes on like chocolate tasting and wine tasting and they got into a conversation about Scotch and it was just like the words they used to describe Scotch.
Doesn't sound appetizing.
Peaty.
Yeah.
Turpentine.
Mm.
And like, again, it's a testament to the amount of flexibility and plasticity in terms of what you can train yourself or get to go from something that's kind of aversive to something that is something you actively seek out because you enjoy it.
Right. Yeah, this is where the expensive stuff starts making more sense. Just in terms, since I don't drink, just smelling them.
Right.
The 10, 12-year-old scotches, I'm like, that doesn't smell good. But then like 15, 18-year-old scotches, and I'm like, this makes sense to me. Because something mellows out. And I think the peat gets dialed back. So like, I don't know if I want smoked dirt flavor. I say that. And then one of the chocolate bars I have here tonight is... I'd describe it as being smoky and earthy, which is the foodie word for dirt. I want to talk about another sense that we don't think of necessarily with food, but the microphone's right up here. Oh, it's just peeking in, actually. Oh, you hear that? That right there is the snap of a well-tempered chocolate bar in a room that today is not melting it, which is good. Because for chocolate to do that, it has to have a certain crystalline structure and like
stay tempered. Yeah,
most people may not be thinking about the beta prime crystals at the time of breaking and eating chocolate, but they do. Like when people get into chocolate, they do associate a good snap with like a certain way it's going to feel and melt.
I mean that mouthfeel for that.
Which, by the way, try the Solstice Tanzania.
Awesome, my favorite.
2-time winner of the Utah Chocolate Society tournament and featured in the episode I did with Deanne of Solstice. So, let's talk about this in the terms of the neuroscience of it. We look at it. That image is not doing it any kind of justice, but
it's got a great luster to it.
Let's see if we can get some reflection. No, probably not, but
for me, these Solstice Tanzania is one of my favorite bars, and so just like seeing them, I get that sort of anticipatory, like, oh, it's my favorite bar.
Right.
I'm really, really, really enjoying and excited to try it and have it again. But then, like, actually, once it put into my mouth, right? Like you start breaking the bar apart, your saliva starts sort of breaking the chocolate down and carrying those molecules to your taste buds.
Right.
And then as you're chewing, right, you get the touch feedback of the mouthfeel of the chocolate, like you're feeling the temper as you're breaking it apart into pieces.
Right.
And then some of the things I was reading the other day was just your because your jaw it's connected to the rest of your skull, like you start hearing the things you're chewing as well.
Oh, interesting.
And that plays into some of the sensory interaction with the chocolate or anything you're eating, really.
Right. That's interesting. Jenny mentioned on the, did you bring that comment on? She and her husband Matt have been tasting different chocolates as we've been talking. I didn't plan particular bars, so if you're watching this saying like, how come I didn't know what chocolates we'd be tasting? It's because I didn't know until today. But yeah, the sound of food and outside of chocolate, it definitely comes in. If you ever go and order fajitas at a Mexican restaurant and they bring it out to you still sizzling, you don't see it, you don't smell it, and yet your mouth starts watering at the sound of sizzling, which is kind of fascinating too, because like that comes in and like the mechanisms of hearing are wacky until it gets into the cochlea and vibrates the liquid and the little hairs in there.
Right.
And then I'm guessing there's some nerve endings tied to those hairs. Maybe they are the nerve endings.
So those hairs are
to
attached to those hairs are attached to a membrane.
Okay.
And as that membrane moves, the hairs basically they deflect and they open a stretch receptor at the bottom.
And then the frequency of that, our brain turns into sound.
Sort of. It's not as simple as a 1-to-1 frequency matching because there's limits to how quickly nerves can fire, and
20 kilohertz is pretty fast.
Yeah. So there's some signal processing and tricks to sort of send those higher frequency sounds, not as just a 1-to-1 like frequency match to your brain. But yeah. So you start hearing things and
check that out with the mental repertoire.
Right.
Like,
match that to what you've experienced before.
Right.
And, as far as taste goes.
Like this bar, 2-time winner of the tournament.
It's a great bar.
So good. So fruity.
Yeah. And then, again, your saliva is breaking them up and carrying those to the taste receptors in your taste buds. And so those are kind of like a mashup between your olfactory bulbs and the skin receptors.
Right.
In that you have sour, sweet, bitter, savory. And as these molecules suspended in your saliva interact with the receptors, they open up channels, and then that produces signal, and that goes to your brain.
Nice.
And produces the immediate flavor for that. As you're chewing, those more volatile molecules go through the back of your mouth into your nose, and then hits the olfactory bulb, the olfactory neurons, and then that interacts with the signals coming from your mouth, and your brain's putting all that together and giving you like the whole taste package.
Right. And as chocolate's melting, we can feel like it absorbs heat to melt, which is part of the physics of melting. And then we don't actually feel temperature, right? We feel the heat gradient.
Yep.
So as it's melting and cooling down, it's absorbing heat from our skin inside our mouth, and we feel that as a cooling sensation. And the fattier the chocolate, the more cool it feels, right? And then somehow it also feels wet the fattier it is, which makes sense because there's more turning to liquid as opposed to the little solid particles suspended in the liquid. Mm-hmm. But yeah, great chocolate, great one to ingredients.
Quick aside about the comment on temperature, right? So if you want really fun experiment to do at home to show that like you don't feel absolute temperature, you feel changes in temperature, right? If you get 3 different bowls, right? You have a bowl of ice water and a bowl of hot water, and in between you have a bowl of lukewarm room temperature water.
Right.
Put your hands in the ice cold water and the hot water for 30 seconds to a minute, and then you take them out and put them into the lukewarm water. And it's pretty trippy what you feel at that point.
Because one of them you'd think, oh, this is burning. The other one's like, it's so cold.
Right. And it's the opposite. Yeah. And same temperature water, you're looking at it, and one hand is telling you one thing and the other hand is telling you a completely different story.
I like going around in my kitchen where I have a laser thermometer, and I look at surfaces, and they're all like right around room temperature, in the 68, 72 degree range, and then feel it. It's like granite countertop. It's like, beam it, feels cold. Wood or plastic feels less cold. No, it's the same number.
And that's the
temperature.
specific heat of the...
Yeah, it has to do with how much it wants to take the heat away from my hand.
Right.
And hold on to its own. And yeah, that's why the tiles that are used to cover the space shuttle, you can heat that up to 10,000 degrees where it's glowing bright white and hold it by the corners, and it won't burn you.
Doesn't it also like
Which is crazy.
Shed it like super quickly? I think there was a video I saw once where
Maybe
right after
it's
it was in the
very low
oven,
density, so I imagine it has fairly low thermal capacity.
and like right after they took it out of the oven, like guy just put his hand on it. He's like, fine.
Well, part of that's because it doesn't transfer heat.
Mhm.
It's an incredible insulator and it has really, I don't know if that's high or low specific heat, but it's one of those. The one that doesn't transfer.
The magic of material science.
Yeah, right. I mean, when the space shuttle's coming in from space, it gets very hot, as it turns out. And if there's a hole, bad things.
Yeah.
Well, as a counterpoint, the bright, fruity, even honeyish flavors of Tanzania, I have here the Francois Pralou Jakarta, which is from France. The beans obviously are from the island of Jakarta. Has a cool little map and shows the dot on the map. This chocolate has been one of my favorites since pretty much the beginning of my experience with fine chocolate. And I always describe it as the Pacific Northwest if it was on fire. So like wet wood and like moss and dirt and smoke and leather. And there's not like, I think once I was tasting this chocolate and I got a vague fruity kind of sensation. But generally speaking, like it's not a fruity chocolate. It's deep, dark, earthy, smoky, leathery, and a complete 180 from some of the bright, expressive, the bright, fruity side of Solstice chocolate.
They're actually pretty interesting, sort of, not an anecdote, but just interesting observation in terms of your experience when you taste something and smell something, especially when it's like hard to put into words what
Right.
it is. Just the act of describing what somebody should be tasting can have a pretty material difference in what they actually end up tasting.
Yes.
So, is it this one?
That's it. Yeah, that's a key point. Because if you just give somebody fine chocolate and you don't give any kind of preface as to what it is they're tasting and why it has a rather bigger price tag on it than cheaper stuff, there's a solid chance that it won't mean a whole lot to them. And even just the simple act of, hey, slow down, smell it, pay attention to what you taste, and basically just telling people to engage their senses and be mindful as opposed to mindless goes a long way towards appreciating food.
And the fun thing is, in Chocolate Society, I mean, we try to be good for the tournaments and not discuss it until after everyone's had it.
Right.
But in a normal meeting, if we're trying something, like I have to wonder at the amount of times people have basically preempted people's tasting notes by just saying like graham cracker or bread or something, and then that's all the rest of the group can taste because
freshly polished shoe. You're like, oh,
because
come on.
you put it in people's heads, and that anticipation, and again the higher level processing for that, right, can change a lot of how you perceive something. So
yeah. Well, yeah. If you want some more there.
Nope.
Same
bar?
Yeah, you can double dip. Early in my chocolate tasting experience, I was worried that my tasting was mostly psychosomatic. People would say, I get that. And before they said it, I didn't get it. Until one time, this is back in the old days, Caputo's had an intro, intermediate, and advanced classes there, which they canceled the advanced when I started the Chocolate Society, and eventually the intermediate as well. But I was in the advanced class. I'd been in chocolate for a few months, been into it, right? And someone was tasting a particular bar, and they said, oh, it tastes like cinnamon. And I was like, No, it doesn't. That is incorrect. And I was like, hey. And what my biggest takeaway was, I don't just taste things because people say. I also can taste things for myself. And that was like a big confidence booster. And it's funny how much confidence makes a difference. If you go in thinking, I, there's a good chance I could taste something. I may notice something I've never noticed before. And maybe I can even put my finger on what it is. Just that level of like positivity in terms of like positive.
Sitting there and like really paying attention to what you're getting out of each bar, each taste that you get. And so brains are super plastic. And so things that you work at, like you can train yourself
Right.
to taste more things, to experience more things. And I mean, you look at all of these niche food hobbies: wine tasting, chocolate tasting, coffee tasting, cheese. Like when you first come into it, right, you can give them something that is super special and like really wild, and they might not really notice all the different subtleties there, as opposed to somebody who's worked at it for weeks or months or years. And you know, they've developed that plasticity, they've developed that subtlety to be able to tease out these things, as well as going like, hey, I enjoy this. I've, you know, for all of the really tasty things that I've done at Chocolate Society, and it's like such a nice environment that sort of every time you taste chocolate gets associated with those emotions and memories. And so it just keeps building on itself.
Yeah, so it's something you can practice and improve at, right?
Yep.
There's a person that no longer lives in the Salt Lake area named Vanessa. Vanessa, if you're watching this, you're my hero when it comes to tasting. I don't think I've ever personally known someone that can peer into it and find the most like descriptors. There's probably a better way of saying that. Sometimes it gets a little on the arcane, esoteric side, but it's always in a way that I love hearing. And yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. Just more power to the people who come to Chocolate Society with like a notebook and like really detailed tasting notes. Because I mean, if you're you're really trying to build that that capacity, right? Like the more you're actively going for it, like the more you're going to build that.
Taste with color map from my friend Hazel.
Yeah,
that helps me because there's all these flavor notes that are on there. And if it was purely psychosomatic, then I would taste everything I see on there. But I definitely don't. I tend to, like, I don't think it's full-blown synesthesia, but I do imagine colors that are associated with other things that I associate that flavor or aroma with. And I go to that region on the Taste with Color map, and there's often a flavor note that is right up, hitting the nail right on the head in that general vicinity.
I mean, even just being able to like prompt yourself with like all these different flavors that, you know, I think it's easier on one hand to basically go like, oh, I remember the smell and flavor of leather versus like blueberries or, and so being able to prompt that instead of like trying to figure out de novo what this tastes like. I think being that comparison's a lot easier than it is like just like coming up with all the different flavor notes cold.
Let alone chemicals, right?
Right.
Yeah. Our last chocolate we're going to be tasting is from Naive. Oh boy, I can do this. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Yes. It's the porcini bar. It's a dark milk with porcini mushrooms blended in it. Are you familiar with this bar?
Not particularly.
This is when I discovered that I love porcinis in a very specific way. It's such a wacky flavor, and it's the umami part of it, which we use umami, the Japanese word, because it was Japanese scientists that were trying to tell Western scientists for decades. There's a fifth thing we taste, and it's savory, and so we use their word. Delightful bar, and so wacky and avant-garde. A lot less snap with this one because it's a milk chocolate.
Still a nice texture though.
It's so mushroomy. which when I saw it, I was cautiously optimistic about how it would taste. And I tasted it, and I'm like, no more caution. I love it. So good.
Still waiting for somebody to make a fish sauce bar. Just that kind of like fishy, salty umami.
Have you heard my interview with DeMontis?
No, I haven't gotten that one. It's coming?
He's done it.
Oh, nice.
I published it a while back, but he did a fish one. And then Fossa out of Singapore, they have one with bonito flakes, which I've not eaten because at no point have I thought, you know what, chocolate's missing? Fish.
Bonito's great, though.
There's a lot of great things that need no chocolate added and vice versa.
Now I'm just thinking of, have you ever had takoyaki? It's a...
Maybe?
So it's a Japanese like street food kind of thing, and it's it's a piece of octopus in this kind of gooey molten that's made in this waffle maker that just basically makes these like bonbon shaped things with the squid inside, and you order them like donuts in like packs of like 6 or a dozen, and they give it to you with like Japanese mayo and this like fish saucy kind of thing, and like just like a scoop of bonito flakes on top.
That's a party right there. I have not. I'd be willing to check that out.
Yeah.
I'll have to check that out. So we got a question. Have I used the IICCT flavor interactive map? I think that's the one that was just talked about with what's the guy's name? Northwest. Brian. Last name. There's a Brian that runs Northwest Chocolate Festival, and I think that Ramon, if that's the one I'm thinking of, please let me know. That seems like a good one to check out. Yeah, what do you think of the porcini bar?
It's really... I like the texture, and like I'm not sure I'm getting like what I think of as mushroom out of it, but it is like that kind of earthy, tangy kind of. Are
you very familiar with porcinis in particular?
No.
When you go eat porcini, this is this is what it tastes like. I mean, I think this right here you can shred and put over like spaghetti with red sauce, and I bet this chocolate on spaghetti with red sauce would be amazing. I'm gonna do it. Yeah, that's gonna be amazing. Like truffle and the porcini chocolate.
I had truffle for the first time maybe 5 years ago on a tasting trip in New York.
That's a great example of like, I have nothing to compare this to when you taste truffle for the first time.
And it was just like, this is really strong. I can see why people like this. I'm okay.
Yeah, I've had people ask me what truffle's like. I'm like, imagine you've never had garlic. I'm like, no. But imagine you've never had garlic, and someone's like, here's like 4 cloves of garlic. And you just pop them in. That's what it's like, especially white truffle, which is way more intense than black. Black truffle you tend to need to cook to bring out the flavor. White truffle is just like, just slaps you around a little bit.
Yeah.
Whew, we have made it an hour and a half. This is our new high water mark for long stream.
Awesome.
Any closing remarks? Any closing questions out there from you guys? Any further things that you want to leave a lasting impression?
No, I mean, I think that's covered a lot of ground, and hopefully wasn't too boring or.
There's at least 2 people left, based on the comments.
But chocolate's great. Neuroscience is great. Happy to be able to bring both of these 2 together.
Great reason to come together, right?
Yeah.
Like 2 great things. Thank you so much for coming on and geeking out with me. This was fantastic. And
thanks for having me and feeding me chocolate.
You're very welcome. If nothing else, I will take away that I have incredibly long cells in my body, and that's weird and awesome. With that, everyone, thank you for joining. It's for Martin Christie and Maricel Presilla. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to check that out, Ramon. Thank you. Everyone, check out IICT Interactive Flavor Map or Flavor Interactive Map. I'm gonna scope that out.
Yeah.
Martin and Marcel are no, they're kind of giants in the industry. So, everyone, thank you so much for joining Chocolate Fascination, the channel and podcast and every website all about fine chocolate. Check out my website, chocolatefascination.com. We've got blog and podcasts and our unicorn merch that will someday make it. Thank you, Matt. This t-shirt will be there, painted by the Chocolate Society's own Katie Steck. Thank you, Katie. And I suppose you don't really have any side you're representing.
No.
Kevin's been Kevin.
Boring and stay off social media.
You've been fantastic. Look out, everyone, for upcoming one, Silvana. I'm going to hit you up. We need to schedule a hard date soon with looking at the food science of chocolate in terms of like getting into the chemicals of what is chocolate. This has been a great one talking about how we experience it. Yeah, check out the podcast and drop me a line. I'd love to hear what you think, any questions. And if you liked it, please hit subscribe and like. It really helps out with the algorithms and stuff. But thank you so much. Thanks, sir. Great to see you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Good to see someone alive.